Hello, everybody. My name is Marvin Wickware, and I'm the Associate Professor of Church and Society and Ethics here at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. It's my joy to welcome you to this 2024 Vine Deloria Jr. Theological Symposium lecture. I'll begin with our land acknowledgement. LSTC recognizes that our school stands on the lands of the Potawatomi, Miami, and Peoria peoples. For thousands of years before their forced removal, this was their traditional homeland, and it continues to hold their ancestral stories and wisdom. We honor and thank the elders of these and other nations, past and present. These lands are still home to many Indigenous people, and we are grateful to learn in this place. November is National Native American Heritage Month. During this month, we honor the culture, traditions, and achievements of Native Americans, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and affiliated island communities. November is also the month in which Vine Deloria Jr. passed on 19 years ago, making this a timely occasion to honor and reflect on his life and work through this symposium. Vine Victor Deloria Jr., born on March 26, 1933, and who died on November 13, 2005, and who was a standing Raksu, was an author, theologian, historian, and activist for Native American rights. He was widely known for his 1969 book, Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian Manifesto, which helped attract national attention to the challenges faced by Native Americans. In 1963, Deloria earned a theology degree from the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, which was then Augustana Seminary in Rock Island, Illinois. From 1964 to 1967, he served as executive director of the National Congress of American Indians. In 1977, he was appointed to the board of the National Museum of the American Indian and became a law professor at the University of Arizona College of Law. In 1978, he established the first master's degree program in American Indian Studies at the University of Arizona. At the height of the American Indian movement and beyond, Vine Deloria Jr. played a significant role in strengthening tribal sovereignty for federally recognized tribes in the United States. In 2013, the annual American Indian and Alaska Native Symposium at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago was renamed in honor of Vine Deloria Jr., who, again, was an alum of LSTC through a predecessor school. The symposium has been held in November every year since it began. This is the 17th year, and is co-sponsored by the Perot Center for Intersectionality Studies at LSTC and the ELCA's Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations. This year, an anonymous donor has also contributed as a sponsor of the event. Thank God for anonymous donors. The focus of this year's symposium is Vine Deloria's first book, Custer Died for Your Sins, in which he writes about the challenges posed to Indigenous people by non-Native people, the U.S. federal government, churches, and others. He offers new ways of thinking about those challenges and a philosophy for how Native nations and leaders of the American Indian movement and others might respond. In this book that remains all too relevant today, Deloria offers both pragmatic and philosophical wisdom about moving forward toward justice. Today's symposium lecture will provide an update on the elements of this book and what has changed today. I now invite LSTC alum Vance Blackfox, director of the ELCA's Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations, who will share more about today's lecture and introduce our speaker.
Osio Nagad, Galanch Dawado. Hello, everybody. My name is Galanch. My English name is Vance Blackfox, and I do get to serve as the Director of Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations. And thank you to Dr. Wickware, who serves on our planning team of this symposium, and to the rest of those who serve on the planning team, both here and
so
online.
That, there's room for everybody. Yeah. And then once you have signed all of these cards,
There we go. And to all the others who helped in making this particular symposium happen. Marvis, we thank you for your work here at LSTC, but also Christian, who helped us with chapel this morning and also part of the planning team, and Jen and Pastor Manuel and all those who were part of the conversations. Wanda, I think you're at home on your Zoom as well. So also thank you to the students, staff, and faculty at LSTC for your continued support all these years of this symposium. But also want to say a special word to Reverend Marlene White Rabbit Helgamo, who was a proponent and a big encourager for the last couple of years of her life. She's since walked on a couple of years ago, but would talk about how it is so important for this church and the rest of the world to reread, as if you read it the first time, to reread Custer Died for Your Sins. What we are experiencing in any country has not changed all that much, and or the things we're experiencing today are similar to the things, sadly, that we were experiencing in the 60s and 70s and before that. And so she was a constant voice in my head and in my ear before she passed and after she passed to say, let's have the church read. And so for those of you who are at home and those of you in the room who have been to elca.org/Indigenous or elca.org/Truth and Healing, you'll see that we have commenced with a reading circle focused on Custer Died for Your Sins over this next few months. And I know some students and others who have engaged in conversation here on campus, and so I'm grateful for that as well. But in addition to that, we thought this would be a great time. Now, Custer was published about 52 years ago or so, and so we missed the anniversary, the big anniversary, but I don't care. We have Vine in our midst every year, and quite frankly, Vine in my heart and in my work every day. And so lucky for us, we get to focus on Custer Died for Your Sins today, and I'm really grateful for that. And I know that Marlene is here with us saying, good job, as she was a part of also the beginning conversations of this symposium as well. So we honor her today, as well as all those who've been a part in some way over the years of making this symposium happen. Even that anonymous donor, we're really, really grateful. Thank you. So I get the pleasure of introducing our symposium lecturer for today. I'm so grateful to be able to do that. He is a friend and someone who has so much to offer the world in so many different ways. And I'm really grateful that he has taken some time from his busy schedule to be here to share with us what he is going to share. I think you'll all find it something worth value for your lives moving forward. But our lecturer for this symposium is the Reverend Dr. Robert Smith. He is Assistant Professor of History at the University of North Texas, specializing in religious history, Indigenous studies, and critical race studies. Robert, a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, is also ordained in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Thank you, Pastor. In addition to many academic articles, he is the author of More Desired Than Other Own Salvation, The Roots of Christian Zionism, and editor with Goran Gunnar of Comprehending Christian Zionism, Perspectives in Comparison. Currently, he is co-researching and writing 3 book-length projects on the movement and discipline of critical race theory under contract with New York University Press, the University of California Press, and Penn State University Press. Along with his research and writing partner, noted rhetoric and writing studies scholar Asia Martinez, who is with us here today, Smith draws on mixed methods ranging from archival to ethnographic to literary and rhetorical analysis to retell the stories of CRT's origins within the broader scope of U.S. history. And so with that, let's give a big warm welcome to our lecturer today, Reverend Dr. Robert O. Smith.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Vance, and thanks to all of you who have had a part in making today happen. It is a joy to be with you here in Chicago and to join all of you who are joining online in conversation about Vine Deloria, Custer Died for Your Sins. The title of my talk today is Red Power, Black Power, and Critical Race Theory. When Vance first approached me to offer this keynote address focused on Vine Deloria's Custer Died for Your Sins, I was in the throes of working with my research and writing partner, Dr. Martinez, on 3 books exploring the topic of critical race theory, known by its acronym CRT. CRT has been a topic of controversy in recent political discourse, you may have heard. The movement's been falsely maligned as inspired by Marxist critical theory, and therefore somehow anti-American and even anti-Christian, These accusations, of course, are hogwash. Moreover, the speech was scheduled for less than 2 weeks after our most recent presidential election. The result of that one election, not to mention some state level and local earthquakes, has again unleashed forces in our society. We've seen rampant misogyny and transphobia, somehow expressed even more transparently, alongside new forms of self-loathing masculinity. Natives throughout Indian country have good reason to anticipate a new spike of violence against Indigenous women and Two-Spirit siblings. On the progressive side of things, television pundits have, since before the election, trained us in how to point fingers and assign blame to whatever ethnic group is most responsible for their preferred candidate's loss. Is it the fault of black men? Maybe Hispanics, to repeat that dubious U.S. Census designation, but especially maybe Latino men. Maybe we can blame Arabs in Michigan. They'll discuss anything at all besides the fact that over 3/4 of the U.S. electorate is made up of white people. A majority of those white people, 52% of white women and 59% of white men, voted for the new president-elect. They also elected the current president and the one before that. Now, given that demographic reality, there's some logic to the Harris campaign's attempt to court the white moderate vote. The only problem with that strategy, which no doubt looked good on paper, is that it didn't factor in the most enduring yet consistently ignored components of U.S. political realities, the interlocking, intersectional permanence of racism and misogyny. Within that reality, 52% of white women voters in 2024 invested in their racial interest over their gendered concerns. Thus, our national elections have again pushed the problem of whiteness squarely in our face. The good news, which at the same time is uncomfortable news, is that we've been here before. Indeed, minoritized communities in the U.S., natives among them, have miscalculated how to navigate whiteness in the past. It's a cyclical problem we face again and again. The writing and thinking of Vine Deloria Jr. provides a stirring reminder that our elders have grappled with similar questions and dynamics. His written legacy reminds us further that Native Americans have made essential contributions to discourse about fundamental problems in the U.S. and the world. Custer Died for Your Sins is one of my absolute favorite books. I'm sure many people participating in this symposium in the room and online would agree with that. The first of Vine's over 20 books is filled with trenchant insights, moving stories, and best of all, biting sarcasm. His way of introducing the perspectives and concerns of Indian country to a broader audience in the late 1960s. I didn't live through the 1960s. But from everything I've read, seen, and heard, it was a time of exhaustion and fear. The U.S. civil rights movement had kicked off with the Brown v. Board decision in 1954. That legal decision sparked broad movements toward formal and social equality for all of the U.S., along with wave after wave of violent white resistance. And that resistance included countless acts of white terrorism, including major events like the 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, and relatively unreported incidents like night riders shooting into black people's homes in rural Harmony, Mississippi. Under the shadow of the Cold War and continental U.S. expansions of war in Southeast Asia, a series of lynchings and assassinations intensified domestic tensions. The NAACP's Mississippi Field Secretary Medgar Evers and President John F. Kennedy were assassinated in 1963. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965. Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated in 1968. The 1968 presidential election returned the presidency to Republicans, to one Richard Nixon. Race and racism were major factors in that political season. The election featured one of the most successful third-party candidates in U.S. history, staunch segregationist and three-time governor of Alabama, George Wallace, who won 46 electoral college votes. It was a violent, tumultuous time. People were on edge. And now, so soon after our 2024 election, many people in the U.S. are feeling something similar. Now, throughout the tumult of the 1960s, as you've heard, Vine Deloria Jr. directed the National Congress of American Indians. During that time, NCAI membership increased from 19 to 156. The organization achieved financial sustainability, and they successfully returned tribal sovereignty to the U.S. federal agenda. During that time I just described. Custer Died for Your Sins was published in 1969 when Deloria was a student at the University of Colorado Law School. It became an essential guide for non-natives seeking to understand American Indian views on American politics and society. The book came out just before the second round of Red Power attempts to claim Alcatraz and other high-profile American Indian movement actions. Today, I'd like to take the opportunity to consider some of Vine Deloria's insights along ideas foundational to critical race theory, developed at roughly the same time. 1969 was also the year Derek Bell, the godfather of critical race theory, joined the faculty of Harvard Law School. Now, soon he was the first tenured black professor in the school's history, but Bell joined Harvard as an affirmative action hire in the wake of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and especially the social turmoil following Dr. King's assassination. And like Deloria, Bell was directly involved in civil rights activities throughout the 1960s. His first professional experiences in the South were as assistant to Constance Baker Motley, later the first black female federal judge, as she, on behalf of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, led James Meredith's case to desegregate the University of Mississippi. A young Derek Bell was standing there by her side. From there, Bell went on to lead over 300 school desegregation cases throughout the South. One striking parallel in their lives is that although Bell and Deloria always had a strong sense of their home communities, for Deloria, the Standing Rock Sioux near Pine Ridge, and for Bell, the black middle-class Pittsburgh neighborhood of The Hill, they worked tirelessly and got themselves involved in other Native and black communities throughout the continent, always grounded, but always out there getting involved. Another striking parallel is that they were both theologically informed legal scholars, concerned with the practical material conditions of their respective communities, and by extension, all other minoritized peoples in the United States. A third parallel is their shared critique of abstract liberalism and deep, abiding disappointment in liberal white people who designated themselves allies to the causes of black and Native liberation. Custer Died for Your Sins can be read as a book-length critique of its primary intended audience, white liberals. Specifically, it's aimed at white liberal churches. Lutherans and Episcopalians are very much in its crosshairs. Deloria indicts liberal missions to Indian reservations and communities no less than older forms which, in his words, sought to Anglo-Saxonize or civilize Native peoples. He describes a trend of, quote, liberal self-helpism, similar to contemporary DEI seminars, that would recite the wrongs of the white man of the last century to make him feel guilty, because when he felt guilty, it would somehow make his efforts more real, and then he was happy again. Unfortunately, the resulting white orgy of self-flagellation, as Vine calls it, not my words, that's Vine, never resulted in effective public communications about problems faced by Native communities today. On top of that, one subject was absolutely forbidden. And that, Deloria says, was any attempt to compare the white man's treatment of Indians with that of other minority groups, because that might have revealed a startling case against the whites' dealings with all dark-skinned peoples. As even a superficial glance at the dynamics of our recent election demonstrates, intersectional concerns of race and gender are no closer to being resolved in 2024 than they were in 1964. Exit polling data demonstrates conclusively that white men and those convinced they will someday be accepted as socially equal to white men remain fiercely protective of their unearned privileges. Given the electorate's choice of explicit racism and misogyny, we can expect another wave of white liberal assistance offered to address the plight of minoritized communities, unless, of course, those minorities voted incorrectly. Throughout Custer Died for Your Sins, Deloria tells stories about how, in 1964, many church people became convinced that the civil rights movement was the only real Christian mission. As in previous eras, however, these white liberals were soon disappointed in their Indian subjects. Rather than pandering to gain white friends, Deloria urges that the imposition of white civil rights logic on Native peoples was a losing proposition. That white logic, it ignores historical, structural, material realities in favor of the newest trends. And against those trends, Deloria pointed out the historical reality in a way that presages today's most sophisticated settler colonial theories. The U.S., he says, quote, adopted two basic approaches in handling blacks and Indians. White people excluded blacks from all programs, policies, social events, and economic schemes, while with the Indian, the process was simply reversed. While black people were forcibly excluded, natives were forcibly included. Now, white liberals in the 60s, certainly not now, ignored all this history and were instead enamored with race relations, a movement to give black people rights equal to those of their white neighbors. But the white imaginary lumped all non-white minorities together under a black-white binary, in which, as Deloria put it, the Indian is defined as a subcategory of black. Such idealism could help neither natives nor blacks in the face of entrenched structural realities. The tragedy of the early days of the civil rights movement, Deloria observed, is that many people, black, white, red, and yellow, were sold a bill of goods, which said that equality was the eventual goal of the movement. But no one had considered the implications of so simple a slogan. Equality became sameness. Now, when equality is the goal, and equality is equated with sameness, the goal becomes assimilation. The goal becomes termination, the extinguishing of difference. Natives, with our countless heritages of resistance through dance, song, land, culture, language, and story, recognize such logic as nothing less than genocide. White liberals don't like it when all that gets pointed out. Some of them hate it, in fact. It's a blue note in the soundtrack of the white liberal orgy of self-flagellation. It's precisely here, however, rejecting the benevolent gatekeeping oversight of white liberals, that red power meets black power. It's important to note that these ideas and expressions were not separate from black civil rights discourse, but in fact were present among and within that movement itself. Think of Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from that jail in Birmingham, Alabama. Quote, "For years now I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never," King wrote in April 1963. "I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate, who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will." I heard Jen say something similar earlier today. King was far from the first black civil rights leader to develop such insight. The previous year, Loren Miller, a close friend of Thurgood Marshall's, published his path-breaking article, "A Farewell to Liberals." He suggested that while white people had a role in the struggle, it should be as foot soldiers and subordinates in a Negro-led, Negro-officered army under the banner of freedom now. In a personal letter to Miller, Derek Bell praised the article, saying that through Miller's insights, all of us will more easily recognize the liberal in our midst who is not truly in our family, but in our way. Custer Died for Your Sins contains a current of thought reflecting Black ambivalence within the civil rights movement, an ambivalence shared by even King himself. By questioning the dominant ideology of abstract liberalism and articulating suspicion of white liberal assistance, Deloria's insights resonate deeply with the foundational impulses of critical race theory. These ideas resonate deeply because they reflect the deep archive of lived experience, the lived experiences of Black and Native communities whose interests Deloria and Bell sought to serve. Derek Bell is often noted as originating the concept of racial interest convergence, in which, as he put it, the interests of Blacks in achieving racial equality will be accommodated only when it converges with the interests of whites. Now, that was in 1980. In 1969, Deloria succinctly provided an example of racial interest convergence when he observed that the white always presents opportunities for cultural enrichment when he's trying to steal Indian land, and that when the white sincerely wants to develop capital resources of the Indian people, he invariably strengthens Indian cultural traits. Land, Deloria says further, has been the basis on which racial relations have been defined ever since the first settlers got off the boat. Minority groups, denominated as such, have always been victims of economic forces rather than beneficiaries of the lofty ideals proclaimed in the Constitution and elsewhere. Here, in 2 sentences, we find a key illustration of Cheryl Harris's vitally important 1993 concept of whiteness as property, alongside a critique of capitalism like those articulated by W.B. Du Bois and Ralph Bunche, all in Vine's thought. Moreover, Deloria's charge that all the white man had succeeded in creating in his time on this continent has been a violent conglomerate of individuals, not a people, and his observation that white culture destroys other culture because of its abstractness stands easily alongside contemporary exemplars of whiteness studies. Deloria's refusal to participate in the civil rights movement resulted from his resistance to Native assimilation into white-dominated U.S. society. In 1969, he observed the irony of how, after decades of struggle for integration, separate but equal has become a battle cry of the Black activists. It had come full circle since Plessy. This made sense to Deloria and other Native leaders of the time, since we couldn't believe that Blacks wanted to be the same as whites. And we knew that even if they did want that, the whites would never allow it to happen. As far as we could determine, white culture, if it existed, depended primarily upon the exploitation of land, people, and life itself. With that perspective, Deloria says, Stokely Carmichael was the first Black who said anything significant. In 1966, Carmichael, who was working for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Mississippi, during the same time Bell was working on school desegregation there, proclaimed Black power by dismissing the fallacious notion that white people can give anybody their freedom. No man can give anybody his freedom. A man is born free. Logically, then, every civil rights bill in this country was passed for white people, not for Black people, since the failure of civil rights efforts can be chalked up to the incapability of whites to deal with their own problems inside their own communities. All of this led Deloria to a simple organizing principle. He quoted Cheyenne River Sioux leader Alex Chasinghawk to make the point that what Indians want is a leave us alone law. In order to keep the country from complete divisiveness, Deloria concludes, separatism must be accepted as a means to achieve equality of personality both for groups and individuals. Now, separatism. That sort of talk makes white liberals a little itchy. It creates anxiety also for a good many people of color convinced that they need white allyship to make any real progress in the United States. Indeed, since the late 1960s, openly critical assessments of white liberals or of integrationist civil rights logic has largely been banned from polite discourse. As Tommy Curry, a Black American philosopher now teaching in the UK, has recently observed, if a work on racism engages race and whiteness through an integrationist lens, then it's considered suitable as race or political theory. If a work does not hold to the multiculturalist and integrationist trajectory of American democracy, it's largely excluded from disciplinary knowledge and condemned as overly political and ideological. The cost is one of being included in the broader conversation of polite society or choosing to stand on the margins. Professor Curry's assessment of Derek Bell holds equally true for Vine Deloria. Contrary to the characterization of Bell as simply addressing race, Bell's work is seeking to establish a paradigm to understand the complexities and historical duration of American racism. Neither Bell nor Deloria had time for a nice, detached, abstract discussion about the intellectual problem of race and racism in the United States. They were interested instead in the historical duration of racism, the observable truth that racism, this idea around which the structures of our life have been constructed through ideology, law, and religion, never diminishes, but instead mutates, adapts, and changes form. Vine Deloria's insights into U.S. history, culture, and law are fundamentally compatible with the analytical tools offered by Bell and other foundational figures within critical race theory. Rather than seeking to validate Deloria's thought by reference to others, my intent is to demonstrate that Deloria should be a regular conversation partner with the ongoing struggle of navigating racial dynamics in U.S. politics and society. His insights from 1969 were expanded greatly throughout his career, especially in his interpretations of law and religion. We do well when we study his thought and extend his legacy. Now, why does it matter that we can identify a convergence of perspectives between Deloria and foundational CRT thinkers? First, in the present moment, I hope it encourages this audience, already predisposed to respect Deloria, to consider greater study of CRT. Second, I find it compelling that we've discovered two different experiential points of view converging on points of critical analysis. That means we're onto something that could be practical and helpful. Moreover, this convergence demonstrates that although different groups have distinct histories, needs, and hopes for the future, we can join in common struggle. As Deloria says, what Indians, Blacks, and Mexicans have in common and where their differences lie should be carefully studied. CRT, formed from the beginning through multiracial coalition, is an academic discipline and movement in which that careful study continues to take place. Now, to bring all this home, I'd like to tell you about someone who combines red power and critical race theory through experiences with both Vine Deloria and Derek Bell. Robert A. Williams, Jr. is an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina and a professor of law and faculty co-chair of the University of Arizona Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program. As director of the largest Indian law program in the United States, maybe the world, Williams stays connected with local tribal nations. He sits on the courts of appeal for both the Pasquayaqui Indian tribe and the Tohono O'odham nations. And he's taken his concern for the rights of indigenous peoples global. He's worked alongside each of the United Nations special rapporteurs on the rights of indigenous peoples and was a key force in drafting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, adopted in 2007. It's a big deal, right? Well, throughout all of his work, Williams has been guided not only by the most sophisticated and nuanced legal theories, but by the power of relationships, and especially the power of stories. He shared some of those stories in an interview Asia Martinez and I conducted toward the beginning of our research on CRT. And when Williams first arrived at Harvard Law School in 1977, he told us, "I had long hair and braids, and I was a little insecure about my identity. This wasn't a great time to be a minority at Harvard. Other minority students have described it as psychological torture." And by the time any minorities were admitted that year, all the fancy Harvard Law School housing with the large stone fireplaces was spoken for. And so Williams lived off campus with a black roommate from DC. And once, after a hostile white student pressed him to reveal his LSAT entrance exam score, his interrogator sneered, "I have a bunch of friends who should be here instead of you." Rob was the only native at Harvard Law School for his entire 3 years. But in his second year, he met Derek Bell. I took the Race and Races course, which was, he told us, usually scheduled against the federal courts course, and all the law review white guys took that other one, resulting in a class where minorities made up the majority. It was amazing to have more than half students of color. It was a real refuge for students in there, he said. Most of us were minorities from middle-class backgrounds. There was a lot of mental correction. It was one of the few classes where I wasn't afraid to raise my hand. Any of you know that feeling? Already in the late 1970s, Bell was sharing stories about his time in the Mississippi civil rights struggle and his key theories of interest convergence and racial realism. Although Williams appreciated Bell's method of teaching through storytelling, he wasn't without critique. There wasn't a lot of Indian stuff in there, Williams told us. I went up to Bell and asked about that, and he said, "That'll be your job," which I took to heart. He was one of my inspirations for going into law teaching. After some time teaching at Rutgers and then at the University of Wisconsin, Vine Deloria reached out and recruited Williams to join him at the University of Arizona. The key piece of advice Vine offered when Williams agreed to move out west was to not live on the west side of Tucson, because if you do, the sun will be in your eyes on the way to work and in your eyes on the way back home. And that's not what you want in the desert. Rob remembers Deloria fondly, recalling their meetings that doubled as outdoor smoke breaks. And once he arrived at Arizona, Vine showed him his file of FU letters, targeted at presidents and other administrators at the university, written in Vine's acerbic, often sarcastic tone. Sometimes that tone got in the way of institutional cooperation. Eventually, though, Williams saw the wisdom of his approach. He was a great mentor to all of us. Vine laid down on the barbed wire and let the rest of us walk across his back. During that time, Williams worked with other legal scholars like Richard Delgado, Mari Matsuda, Patricia Williams, and Kimberly Crenshaw. He's counted among the founders of CRT. He's one of the people, along with Matthew L.M. Fletcher of the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa at the University of Michigan School of Law, who works assiduously to combine the insights of native legal theory, so heavily informed by Deloria, with critical race theory. He brings them together. Now, both have dedicated sustained energy to the complicated but necessary issue of freedmen's recognition and rights within the sovereign governance of formerly slaveholding native nations, like my own. Both also focus on the centrality of story. So as I close, let me read a bit from Rob Williams' preface to Richard Delgado's first collection of Rodrigo Chronicles. In the Native American tradition, to assume the role of storyteller is to take on a very weighty vocation. We recall the memories of our grandmothers and grandfathers and their grandmothers and grandfathers through the stories told by the storyteller. To be a storyteller is to assume the awesome burden of remembrance for a people and to perform this paramount role with laughter and tears, joy and sadness, melancholy and passion, as the occasion demands. The storyteller never wholly belongs to himself or herself. The storyteller is the one who sacrifices everything in the tellings and retellings of the stories belonging to the tribe. A part of the story I've shared today with you is that the ideas of at least one elder, Vine Deloria Jr., are vitally relevant today. Those ideas complement another incisive school of thought, and both are carried forward by at least one renowned Indigenous legal scholar. Now, stories invite the lived memory of the past and call us to renewed action, so that given the deep agreement between Vine Deloria's foundational insights and the tenets of critical race theory, what are we called to do? I close with these 4 points. First, while many of us are concerned about intensifying fascist trends in the US and around the world, it's clear that we are not past the problem of the white moderate. If we're to make any headway at all against the forces of racism in the US and in the world, we must sharpen our ability to critique the dominant ideologies of abstract liberalism and the persistence of liberal colorblind racism. White liberals are not just an annoyance, they are a threat. Second, following the examples of thinkers like Deloria, Bell, and their many students, we must build networks of critical solidarity based on clear analysis. The shared problem of white supremacy affects different communities in different ways. We operate with different goals. We must, however, join in common cause whenever possible. Third, we must ensure that our analysis and activity are informed by both local and international information and solidarity. Deloria and Bell, both nationally known leaders, kept close communications with local community leaders while remaining abreast of global concerns. We must extend our horizons and expand our networks internationally, taking inspiration from Indigenous communities who resist increasing efforts to diminish Indigenous sovereignty and life, and not hesitating to stand with Indigenous peoples under present threat of genocide. Fourth, we must remind ourselves that the political and cultural struggles we face in the US have been with us for decades, if not centuries. The bad news is that the white supremacy and misogyny continue to take new and different forms, but the good news is that nothing we're facing now is different than what Deloria and Bell and all our ancestors have already confronted. We come from peoples of great endurance, and we will continue to endure. It is time to renew our confidence in the power of our people. It is time to renew our confidence in the power of our stories. It is time to allow remembrance of our elders to shape our response to the present. Because these stories, rather than the distractions of national election campaigns and politicians preening for cameras, are the ones that sustain us, the ones that drive us forward. We are called to bear the awesome burden of remembrance for a people. And maybe, as Vine Deloria would have it, along with laughter and tears, joy and sadness, we bring a good dose of incisive analysis and sardonic wit. Thank you.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. You have done me proud. You have done Vine and Marlene proud. And we're just so grateful for your incredible gifts that you're willing to share with us as an Indigenous person, as a Christian person, and someone who wants to love us. So thank you for sharing with us today. Want to remind folks that we do have another panel discussion tomorrow evening as a part of the symposium tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. That will all be virtual, so check out the LSTC website or the ELCA website at Truth and Healing and join us at 7 o'clock Central tomorrow. But I think we need to give this gentleman another round of applause for Thank you and have a good day. Wado.